There's a lot of people who have different opinions on which Final Fantasy character is the greatest of all time. And if someone walked up to me and told me that Cloud Strife would probably be in the top five or top 10 or what have you, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that person, considering how successful Final Fantasy VII was following its release back in 1997 for the PS1. I believe it managed to reach over 10 million copies sold on the PS1, and the remake, which came out a few years ago on I believe it was the PS4 and the PS5, did over 3.5 million copies sold. So the game is still very popular to this day. And you look at Cloud Strife, this is a character that is known by, I guess, gamers across the world. It's known by casuals, and, hardcore gamers definitely know who Cloud Strife is. One of the reasons why he was probably so popular when he came out back in 1997 was because, I guess, Final Fantasy VII was the first 3D game within the entire series, and that was something that had a lot of people very excited. Also, the fact that Cloud Strife was very different from traditional heroes that came in preceding Final Fantasy games before 7, because he was more of an anti-hero, because he was a mercenary, even though he saved the world. And also, you had more charismatic characters in that game as well. You had Tifa Lockhart, who was the main Didragonus in that game, and then you have Sephiroth, who is the main villain. He's arguably the greatest video game villain of the 90s decade. And, I feel like Final Fantasy VII was a game that was A, ahead of its time, B, it set the bar very high for the rest of the series. And not to say that a lot of the games that came out after Final Fantasy VII were not good, because there were a lot of good games. You look at Final Fantasy VIII, which is underrated. Final Fantasy IX was good. 10 was good. 12, I think it's overlooked a lot. And Final Fantasy 14 and 15 were actually pretty good. So yeah, I think a lot of Final Fantasy games that came out after 7 were actually decent to, being really good. It's just that, I don't know, it's just that the characters in a lot of Final Fantasy games from 8 onwards are not as memorable as the ones from Final Fantasy 7. And, I wouldn't say just because of how successful Final Fantasy VII was that Cloud Strife is the greatest, character within the entire series, because everybody has their own respective preferences. I mean, some people would probably like the Gull Wings a little bit better. Some people would probably prefer Noctis from Final Fantasy 15. There are various characters within the entire series that people have more preference over, and in terms of who they think is the best Final Fantasy character ever created. But I would definitely say that Cloud Strife would be universally in the top 5 in terms of being the greatest Final Fantasy character of all time in relation to being a protagonist. He's definitely one of the more memorable JRPG characters of gaming history, and it's hard to believe that Final Fantasy VII it was released 25 years ago. It was released back in 1997, so yeah, that was 25 years ago, and to this day it still holds up nicely. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that characters like Sephiroth and Cloud Strife and Tifa Lockhart were very popular, and I guess all characters made a good impression in their video game debut all those years ago.